Good morning. My presentation today is on justice, injustice, perceptions, and identity within the three books that I read for this class. The events of Helter Skelter occurred in 1969, making this book our middle ground out of the whole three. Overall, Helter Skelter demonstrated the cult ideology that can form behind members when they find someone who is charismatic and full of leadership, along with the horrible crimes they committed and their satisfaction with bodily mutilation. The theme of Helter Skelter was that the only one who should play God is God himself. Charles Manson believed that he was Jesus Christ, and he indoctrinated his cult members into believing that he was indeed Jesus Christ, and that he would lead them to freedom, to the center of the earth, to live in a magical world of happiness, and that they were the chosen ones. But to be able to be willing and worthy to be a chosen one, he had them commit horrible, heinous crimes, including murder and bodily mutilation. Within Helter Skelter, the phrase Helter Skelter itself was brought up. A Helter Skelter is a type of swirly slide usually found at fairgrounds. It was also it was also a lyric from a song by the Beatles, and Charles Manson believed that the song by the Beatles that featured Helter Skelter was subliminal calling out that people are indecent and that he was meant to kill. The phrase pig is used a lot too within Helter Skelter, but not in the typical oink oink sort of pork that one might expect. Rather, pig was used to define cops, to say that these individuals are less than human, that they are fat and stupid and stinky. Now, that's not usually how the term pig is used. However, that's the way that Charles Manson himself decided he wanted to use it. Then it's creepy crawling. Creepy crawling itself just sounds like someone who's crawling around creepy. Like, that doesn't sound that odd. But when you realize the actions that went behind creepy crawling, you might feel a little disturbed. You see, the Manson family called breaking into people's houses without them noticing, rearranging their furniture silently, and having them reawake to see that all of their stuff has been moved around without them moving it. Creepy crawling. That's pretty creepy. No one died during creepy crawling, but it sure scared a heck of a lot of people. Charles Manson himself, though, was the driving factor behind all these heinous crimes, all the helter-skelter, the creepy crawling, behind the bodily mutilation. He was just a singer-songwriter. But now, he has the wonderful title that Wikipedia has given him of singer-songwriter, cult leader, and murderer, Charles Manson. He was described to have been charismatic and an intellectual who is able to just really, be the whole party when he steps in the room, if I could say myself. And I feel as though if Charles Manson didn't have, the ability to be like, I'm Jesus, and everyone would reply, yeah, you're Jesus, then the events of Helter Skelter would have gone along, a long different way. Because Charles Manson was able to use who he thought he was, Jesus, to persuade a large group of people into doing his bidding. He had girls that were various ages of 15 to 20 living with him that he would call the girls, and he was free to fraternize and sexually exploit them, and they were okay with that because he was Jesus. He used what people thought he was to bolster himself. And I think that's admirable in the sense of I'm astonished he could do that, but I'm still upset with it because I don't enjoy how that happened in the first place. But luckily, Charles Manson is dead. He died in 2017, I believe. But throughout Helter Skelter, you see a lot of untrustworthy professionals. Obviously, these events were taking place in the 60s, the 70s, so we didn't really crack down as much on like data collection and evidence collection from crime scenes. Oh no. From crime scenes. But the people who are the forensic officers who are collecting blood samples didn't test all the blood samples. They didn't collect samples from every splatter of blood on the sites either, which is really upsetting because had they done that, we might have gotten more evidence to collect for potential suspects. There was a lot of just general cowardice, I want to say, towards approaching the Tate cases and the LaBianca cases. And I believe that was out of fear for the murderer himself, Charles Manson, or out of a general disbelief of the events that occurred because they were horribly bloody and gory, mixed with a general fear of that happening to them. And I can understand and respect that. But that led to a lot of untrustworthy professionals who were, skimping on doing their jobs, who didn't collect enough evidence and information to be used. As for the murders, they went, under the bus for quite a while. I mean, no one could figure out who killed those 7 people. Not, Charles Manson developed a pyramid scheme where he was at the top, and he had all these underlings below him that wouldn't tell anyone who he was until they started talking. Eventually, the murderers for the LaBianca and Tate crimes went to jail for originally a death sentence. However, in the 1970s, California repealed its death sentence law, so they can't have death sentence anymore. So they got resentenced for life in prison. And Susan Atkins, one of the murderers who killed the LaBiancas, was begging for a release to be able to live her last few days outside of prison because she was dying with cancer. But she was denied every single time. And Charles Manson, when he was applying for parole, he was denied every single time he applied until he died. And I think that the injustice of the untrustworthy professionals is balanced out by the fact that once they finally caught the murderers, they were sent to life in prison. I think that's fair. Though I would have preferred them to die. But that's a topic for another day. As for the perceptions that happened in Helter Skelter, obviously there was a lot of people who believed that Charles Manson was Jesus, that he was God, and I touched on this a little bit earlier with identity. I think that their ability to perceive him as such gave him more influential power over them. And as for Susan, Manson was the one who impregnated her. And Susan Atkins believed that Charles Manson was the kindest soul she'd ever met, and that he'd saved them all. But obviously he didn't save them all, and he didn't seem to be the kindest soul after he had those 7 people murdered. Murders in the Rue Morgue was written in 1841 by Edgar Allan Poe, and it was the very first book in our timeline of books. Murders in the Rue Morgue was a detective story about unfathomable murders. It was where these 2 rich, well-off women were killed in the dead of the night, and there were sounds of howling and deep voices, and when interviewed, no one could really identify the language. And one woman had her hair ripped off and she was scalped, and another was shoved up a chimney, head feet first. And that's something that the detectives thought was entirely incapable for a human to do. So who committed these murders? I believe the theme of Murders in the Rue Morgue with shortcomings and expectations can lead to failure. This is because the detectives didn't broaden their... The detectives didn't expand their field of vision. They didn't think outside the box. They kept their ideas close to them, and they didn't divert from those. Murders in the Rue Morgue focused a lot on the term egress, and that means to exit a place. I think that although it was being used literally, there could be some sort of subcontext behind it, because you need to egress outside of the box of thinking. And here's why. You see, because they were so kept inside of that straight line of thinking of, okay, so it was a Russian man and a tiny little French man who actually killed them. They needed to think more than that. Instead of who, they need to think what. And that was revealed at the end of the story, within the identity of the murderer. A wild orangutan. You see, I feel as though it's kind of ironic for Poe to say that the murderer was an orangutan. Sure, it could have been taken just literally, but I'm not going to take it literally. I believe that, though, the orangutan was to represent the unmatchable anger and hate that we feel as the beasts within. Because this orangutan was scared. It was scared. And when people are scared, they lash out. The orangutan was curious. He had escaped from his horrible master that would beat him and whip him. And he was in this new little cottage, and he found these people, but they screamed when they first saw him. And that scream scared him. So he acted out. And when he saw how he had acted out, he tried to hide the evidence. I feel pity for that orangutan. But I feel as though he was important to the story. He made for a good ending. I laughed. I cringed too. As for the prosecution of the murderer, when the master of the orangutan was found and interviewed, it was clear that our detective was just doing it out of spite. He was sort of coy, mocking, as if he knew that nothing that the owner could say could save him, because he had an illegally possessed orangutan. And because of that, I'm wondering about the justice with the liabilities of illegal animal trade. Because, so that if the orangutan was the one who murdered them, does the orangutan go to jail? Does the owner of the orangutan go to jail? Who goes to jail here? And that's where I don't know how to find the balance of justice and injustice within the situation. We can't send an orangutan to jail. He'll just kill everyone. But we can't just send the owner of said orangutan to jail if the said owner of the orangutan didn't kill anyone. It's sort of difficult to find a common ground on this sort of discussion, because some people will say that the orangutan should be killed and the owner to jail. That's understandable. However, I personally am not qualified enough to give the verdict on this debate. I believe that the way that the suspects perceived the murderer to be, this big, brawly man of a different language that they spoke that they'd never heard, but they thought they recognized. They thought that he was German, he was Russian, Spanish, French, but all of them were wrong. He was an orangutan. But because they based these ideas off the killer on, another language that they never knew, people they've never met, really gives us a little keyhole sight into how we perceive people around us. That, okay, so this man speaks another language that I don't understand. Is he, dangerous? Because we can't communicate. because we can't talk about things, we can't understand each other. Is he dangerous? And I mean, in relation to this orangutan, yeah, the orangutan is dangerous. He murdered the two ladies. It was disgusting. There was a lot of like body horror. Not good. But this orangutan wasn't born to be a murderer. But I enjoyed reading through how the witnesses perceived the murderer to be, because it really gave me insight into current events, how we see each other. As for the perceptions of intelligence, towards the beginning of the story, there's a long ramble about intelligence and being smart. And I feel as though, like, showing off your powers of deducting is kind of cool. But, I mean, in modern society, what value do we place on intelligence? How do we feel about it? I found that if you're perceived to be smart, if you're perceived to know everything, people look up to you. But they also kind of exclude you because they feel as though you can't relate to their personal problems anymore. And that kind of sucks. But I feel as though that's something we can work towards more as a society in the future moving forwards. So, to compare Helter Skelter and Murders in the Rue Morgue, what do they have in common? Both of them have drug use. Helter Skelter is a whole cocktail of drugs that I can't list all of, but there's cocaine, there's alcohol, there's heroin, a bunch of illegal drugs, and legalized substances such as alcohol. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, they smoke, and they do some cocaine, I believe. But it's not, like, anything super heavy. No, sorry, no. My bad. Murders in the Rue Morgue is just tobacco. But they both have crazy rich people getting murdered. What's up with those rich people and dying? Both of the women in Murders in the Rue Morgue, dead because they're filthy rich. But nothing was stolen. In Helter Skelter, all 7 of the victims were filthy rich. And they were murdered. But nothing was stolen. Coincidence? I think not. And both of them have an incompetent police force, where the police can't figure out who the murderer was, so they need a little outside help. And I think that's kind of important to focus on moving forward. Our final book was The Crooked Room. It was written in 2018. And an overview of this book was that it was about a family ritual that happened every 25 years where they had to sacrifice a family member to Satan to keep their money and their riches because they're filthy rich. There's a lot of cult undertones suggesting that potentially this is a cult and the members of the family have been indoctrinated, but that's for another day. I feel as though the theme of The Crooked Room is greed is a fundamental human desire, because the entire events of the story are only taking place because their great-grandfather decided, I'm going to sell my soul to the devil, I want money. So he did that. And look how that turned out, Gramps. You're killing your kids off. Good job. But the selection. Generally, when one thinks of the phrase selection, we're thinking about being in the grocery store and picking out fruits or veggies or what we want to eat. In this case, the selection is referring to the cult-like ritual where they have a name drawn out of I don't know, they never describe it. I have like a big, they never describe it, but I always imagined it to be like a big glass bowl. But they draw the names out, and they select the member of the Alden family who they're going to murder. And generally, when one thinks of selecting, you don't think about murder. However, the Crooked Room decided to use that phrase as its main focus. The identity of the great-grandfather is one of a rich man who has influenced the rest of his family members, despite being dead, to carry on this tradition so they can continue being rich. And that has bred a lot of like-minded folk that think, okay, murder is cool if I get to be rich. And that influence, despite their great-grandfather being dead, is quite astounding, really. But this story has no sense of justice. There is no end. There is no way to stop the selection. And that's unfortunate, because the Alden family will forever be in a cycle of dying at the age of 25. Or older if they don't get selected. But the room is where the main character is sent because he was selected. And, he perceived it to be this long, slanted, oblong room, right? It has different sized walls, different colors, different sized roof. And he perceives it to be that way. He describes it as horrifying because he's watching his family members die over and over again. But that really leaves us as like the reader with an augmented perception, okay? Of, is our main character insane? Is our main character an untrustworthy narrator? We don't know. And that's compelling. It's compelling to see, and it's interesting to think about. Between all three of these books, they all center around some sort of implied or legitimate drug use. There are horrible, bloody murders in all of them, unfathomable deaths, and filthy rich people. So, I can infer that if you're filthy rich and you do drugs, you're probably going to get murdered in some unfathomable way. I kid. But, you see, this brings us to a timeline that I was referencing earlier. 1841, 1969, and 2018. All of these books are on this timeline, but it's interesting to see how it goes from fiction to a real-life true crime and back to fiction. This little endless cycle of sorts of who came first, the chicken or the egg. What murders could have inspired Murders in the Rue Morgue? Did it always start as fiction? Will it always end in true crime? We don't know. But, they all have these disgusting murders shown. People are dying unnecessarily. And it begs the question of, is this a potential cycle? Does life imitate art? Let you make the decision. These three books, though they tell their own stories, share the same core concepts. Disgusting murders, unfathomable crimes, incapable police forces, and drug use. And I think that if we focus on these and look for them through other parts of text, in other current events, maybe we can pull this web together a little closer, really get to the root of it. But until then, have a nice day.